For decades, Peter Popoff stood before millions of television viewers as a messenger of divine certainty. His voice rang with conviction, his hand pointed with authority, and his words carried promises that pierced deep into the lives of the desperate. He claimed God spoke to him directly. He said he could hear prayers whispered in private homes. He promised miracles, cancer cured, debts erased, lives restored, and for a time, millions believed him. Born in 1966 in West Germany, Popoff was raised in a deeply religious household. His parents were traveling faith healers who moved frequently, preaching a version of Christianity rooted in signs, wonders, and divine intervention. From a young age, Peter learned how belief could move crowds and how certainty, when delivered publicly, could feel indistinguishable from truth. He observed how people leaned forward when miracles were promised, how suffering made minds open, and how hope could override skepticism. By the early 1980s, Popoff was no longer just a preacher. He was a television phenomenon, broadcasting across the United States. His revival meetings filled stadiums, and his programs reached millions of households weekly. Viewers watched as he walked through crowds, stopping suddenly, calling out names, illnesses, addresses, deals that appeared impossibly precise. He claimed God had revealed every word. The crowd gasped, tears followed, donations surged. Popoff's genius was presentation. He framed himself not as a healer, but as a humble vessel, merely the messenger of divine truth. He told audiences God knew them intimately, that heaven had selected their suffering for healing, that faith could unlock miracles if paired with obedience. And obedience, he stressed repeatedly, often came in the form of financial seed faith. He urged viewers to send money, sometimes their last dollars, with the promise that God would multiply it. The poorer the giver, the more powerful the miracle. He claimed people mailed checks they couldn't afford. Elderly pensioners sent rent money. Families struggling with terminal illness emptied savings accounts, all for the promise that Popoff spoke directly to God on their behalf. Behind the scenes, however, a darker reality was unfolding. In 1986, skeptical investigators and journalists began asking questions. The miracles were too perfect, the information too precise, the timing too convenient. Enter James Randi, a professional illusionist and prominent skeptic who believed Popoff was not a conduit of God but of deception. Randi and his team attended Popoff's revival services equipped with radio scanners. What they heard would eventually dismantle one of the largest religious frauds in modern history. Through the static, a woman's voice could be heard feeding Peter Popoff information in real time: names, illnesses, addresses, donation histories. The voice belonged to his wife, Elizabeth Popoff, reading from prayer cards filled out by audience members before the show. The divine revelations were nothing more than information relayed through an earpiece hidden beneath Popoff's hair. During live performances, Elizabeth instructed him precisely where to go and what to say. She has ovarian cancer. She lives on Park Street, wheelchair. Popoff repeated the words publicly, crediting God. The crowd erupted. Faith surged. Donations followed. The illusion was devastatingly effective. When the recordings were exposed publicly, millions were stunned. In 1987, Randi released audio evidence on national television, playing the conversations between Peter and Elizabeth Popoff in real time. Viewers watched Popoff pause, wait for instruction, then deliver miracles exactly as they were fed to him. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Popoff's credibility collapsed overnight. Federal investigations followed. The Federal Trade Commission launched inquiries into consumer fraud. Court documents revealed that Popoff had amassed millions while telling followers they would receive divine wealth in return. In reality, many miracles never occurred. The sick remained ill. The bankrupt remained poor. The only consistent financial recovery was Popoff's. In 1987, Peter Popoff's ministries declared bankruptcy, listing debts exceeding $10 million. Television networks dropped his programs. Faith organizations distanced themselves. He vanished from public prominence, but this was not the end. What shocked observers most was not the exposure but Popoff's return. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, he resurfaced under a revised image, this time promoting miracle water. He claimed it carried divine power, capable of healing disease and financial hardship. The water was mailed to contributors free, he said, but donations were heavily encouraged. Once again, vulnerable viewers responded. Investigations revealed the water was ordinary tap water. Despite this, Popoff's operations flourished again. By 2015, reports indicated he had quietly rebuilt a multi-million-dollar empire, including luxury homes and private aircraft. The deception had changed form, but the core methodology remained the same: desperation, faith, promises, and money. Legal consequences were limited. While Popoff faced fines and regulatory scrutiny, he avoided long-term imprisonment. The psychological damage, however, was irreversible for many of his followers. People reported losing homes, marriages, and years of trust not just in Popoff, but in faith itself. The true cost of Peter Popoff's deception wasn't financial alone, it was the erosion of belief. Survivors spoke of shame of how deeply they had wanted to believe, how hope had blinded them, how devotion had been weaponized. Popoff never admitted deliberate fraud. He framed exposure as spiritual persecution. To this day, he continues limited ministry under new branding, a testament to the unsettling reality that belief, once broken, can be rebuilt if hope is offered convincingly enough. Peter Popoff fooled millions not by force, but by understanding human vulnerability. He didn't steal with violence, he stole with promises. He didn't command obedience, he made faith feel conditional. And the darkest truth of all remains: even after being exposed, even after evidence was undeniable, belief proved harder to dismantle than lies. Because when faith is the currency, deception doesn't need to be perfect-tonally persuasive. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For millions of Americans in the late 20th century, Jimmy Swaggart was not just a preacher, he was a voice that filled living rooms, a moral authority delivered through television screens with thunderous conviction. Born in 1935 in Ferriday, Louisiana, Swaggart emerged from poverty, Pentecostal fervor, and familial legacy to become one of the most influential televangelists in U.S. history. His sermons were fiery, unapologetic, and absolute. He spoke endlessly about sin, sexual immorality, and divine judgment. And then, at the height of his power, the man who condemned others most loudly was exposed for secretly living the very life he preached against. Swaggart's rise began humbly. Raised in a deeply religious household, he was the cousin of rock and roll legend Jerry Lee Lewis, a contrast that Swaggart himself often cited as proof of the divergent paths souls could take. While Lewis chased fame through music, Swaggart pursued salvation through the pulpit. He preached young, married early, and built a reputation as a dynamic Pentecostal speaker whose emotional delivery brought congregants to tears. By the 1970s and early 1980s, Swaggart's ministry had exploded. His televised sermons aired globally. His broadcasts reached over 100 million viewers in dozens of countries. He sold millions of gospel albums, published religious books, and built a sprawling ministry empire based in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Donations poured in tens of millions annually from viewers who believed they were supporting a man chosen by God to speak uncomfortable truths. Swaggart's authority was fueled in part by his relentless condemnation of others. He publicly denounced homosexuality, adultery, pornography, and any deviation from strict Pentecostal morality. He attacked rival evangelists, including Jim Bakker, long before Bakker's own scandal broke. Swaggart positioned himself as incorruptibly untainted by temptation, immune to hypocrisy. This carefully constructed image collapsed in 1988. In February of that year, Swaggart was confronted by leadership within the Assemblies of God, his denomination. Investigators had obtained photographs and testimony proving that Swaggart had repeatedly hired sex workers in New Orleans. The encounters were not isolated lapses, but part of a sustained pattern of behavior carefully hidden, while he publicly condemned others for perceived moral failings. The revelation detonated across American media. For followers, the betrayal cut deeply. This was a man who had preached sexual purity as salvation itself, who had warned that moral failure invited divine punishment, who had built an entire brand on righteousness. And now, incontrovertible evidence showed that behind closed doors, he lived in direct contradiction to every sermon he delivered. The Assemblies of God responded swiftly. Swaggart was defrocked, suspended from ministry, and ordered to undergo rehabilitation and counseling. He was barred from preaching for a minimum of 2 years, potentially longer. The denomination's judgment was clear. His authority had been compromised beyond repair. But the public reckoning had only begun. On February 21, 1988, Jimmy Swaggart stood before his congregation and delivered a confession that would become one of the most infamous moments in religious broadcasting history. Tears streamed down his face as his voice trembled. "I have sinned," he said. "I beg you to forgive me." The speech was emotional, unscripted, and devastating. Millions watched in silence. Some wept with him. Others felt anger, confusion, and disbelief. The confession was brief, vague, and notably absent of detail. He did not specify what he had done, nor whom he had harmed, only that he had failed God. For supporters, it was a moment of mercy. For critics, it was a masterclass in damage control. Behind the scenes, however, Swaggart refused to fully comply with church discipline. Rather than step away from ministry quietly, he returned to the pulpit after just 3 months, openly defying the assemblies of God. As a result, he was permanently removed from the denomination. This act transformed the scandal from a moral collapse into an institutional rebellion. Swaggart continued preaching independently, retaining television access and donor funding. Many followers stayed. Some believed his tears were genuine repentance. Others accepted the narrative that he was being persecuted. Financial donations, though reduced, never ceased entirely. Faith, once established, proved shockingly resilient even when credibility was shattered. Then came 1991. Swaggart was stopped by police in India or California after being found with another sex worker. The arrest report was damning. This was no youthful mistake, no one-time lapse. The behavior was ongoing, even after exposure, confession, and national disgrace. This second scandal obliterated any remaining claims of repentance. Public reaction was far harsher than before. Late-night comedy skewered him. Religious leaders distanced themselves. Former supporters described feeling manipulated, used emotionally, spiritually, and financially. Donations collapsed further. Television networks reduced broadcasts. The empire shrank, but never entirely disappeared. Despite repeated moral failure, Swaggart never faced criminal charges beyond minor infractions related to solicitation laws. His greatest consequences were reputational, not legal. And therein lay the haunting truth. Spiritual betrayal often leaves no courtroom trail. The damage was deeply psychological. Former congregants spoke of religious trauma, shame, and confusion. Many described how Swaggart's obsession with sin had already induced fear and guilt, only for those messages to collapse under the weight of hypocrisy. People questioned not only Swaggart's integrity, but the framework of faith itself. If the loudest voice against immorality was secretly indulging in it, what did righteousness even mean? Critics argued Swaggart's real crime was not sexual misconduct, but manipulation. His sermons weaponized fear. His authority demanded obedience. His fall exposed how absolute moral authority, when unaccountable, invites abuse. In later years, Swaggart retreated from mainstream attention. He maintained a reduced ministry, continued broadcasting to niche audiences, and rarely addressed the depth of the damage caused. While he acknowledged sin, he never fully confronted the paradox of his legacy, a man who preached heaven while privately chasing secrecy. Today, Jimmy Swaggart is remembered less for his sermons than for the moment he broke down on television, apologizing, yet never truly answering the question that haunted millions. How does a man condemn sin so loudly while living so quietly inside it? The answer lies not in temptation, but in power. Because when faith becomes authority, and authority goes unquestioned, hypocrisy doesn't just survive, it thrives. Swaggart fooled millions not because he lied about sin, but because he convinced them he stood above it. And when that illusion collapsed, it didn't just expose a preacher, it exposed how desperately people want to believe that someone, somewhere, is pure enough to lead them. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For years, Ted Haggard was considered one of the most powerful pastors in America. Presidents sought his counsel. Lawmakers listened when he spoke. Millions of evangelicals trusted his moral authority without hesitation. He wasn't just a preacher, he was a gatekeeper of influence, a man who could shape national conversations about faith, sexuality, and morality. And behind that influence, hidden carefully from public view, was a life that contradicted everything he demanded from others. Born in 1956, Ted Haggard's rise through evangelical Christianity was deliberate and calculated. He founded New Life Church in Colorado Springs in the 1980s, growing it from a small congregation into a megachurch with tens of thousands of attendees. His sermons were calm, intellectual, and authoritative. Unlike fiery televangelists, Haggard projected reason and stability, a pastor who appeared grounded, trustworthy, and serious. That image made him invaluable to the religious right. By the early 2000s, Haggard had become president of the National Association of Evangelicals. Representing over 30 million Christians in the United States, he was regularly invited to the White House. He advised presidents on faith-based issues. He spoke publicly against homosexuality, same-sex marriage, and what he described as moral decay in American society. To his followers, he was not merely preaching beliefs, he was defending God's order. What no one outside a very small circle knew was that while Haggard condemned homosexuality from the pulpit, he was secretly engaging in years-long sexual encounters with male sex workers. The contradiction wasn't momentary or accidental. It spanned nearly a decade. The deception unraveled in 2006. A man named Mike Jones, a Denver area sex worker, came forward publicly with allegations that Haggard had paid him for sex and purchased methamphetamine from him. Jones provided voice messages, financial records, and detailed timelines. He described repeated encounters, not a single lapse. He spoke calmly, matter-of-factly, and his evidence was devastating. At first, Haggard denied everything. He went public, insisting the claims were false. He framed himself as a victim of extortion and character assassination. Supporters rallied. Church elders stood by him. Too many. The accusations felt impossible, not because the evidence was lacking, but because belief had replaced discernment. That shield collapsed fast. Within days, New Life Church launched an internal investigation. The results contradicted Haggard's denials. Confronted privately, he admitted to having purchased drugs and engaging in immoral conduct. The admission shattered his credibility instantly. Ted Haggard resigned from every leadership position, pastor, association president, spiritual advisor in a matter of hours. One of the most powerful evangelical leaders in America fell with stunning speed. But the real damage was just beginning. Congregants described shock that bordered on grief. Many had raised children under his teachings. Others had voted, donated, and structured their moral lives around his guidance. LGBTQ individuals, already harmed by years of condemnation, experienced the revelations as both vindication and cruelty, proof that the man shaping policy against their existence had lived openly in secret. Former church members spoke later about repression and fear, about sermons that warned that homosexuality led to destruction, about counseling sessions where gay congregants were urged to repent, suppress, or heal, all while their pastor lived freely in private. The hypocrisy cut deep. Haggard entered a period of counseling overseen by fellow pastors. Though critics quickly noted the lack of law enforcement involvement, no criminal charges were filed. The transactions had occurred between consenting adults. The drugs were not pursued legally. Once again, the greatest penalty for a religious leader was collapse of reputation, not incarceration. Publicly, Haggard framed himself as broken but redeemable. He spoke about temptation, about spiritual warfare, about failure and restoration. To supporters, he was a cautionary tale of sin. To critics, he was proof that unchecked authority corrodes integrity absolutely. What disturbed many observers was not that Haggard fell, but how easily influence evaporated consequences. Within a few years, he returned to ministry. Using carefully chosen language, Haggard rebranded himself as Restored. He and his wife founded a new church under a different name. He avoided national attention, but retained a loyal following. His message softened but never fully addressed the damage left behind. Survivors of religious trauma pointed out the pattern: exposure, apology, retreat, reemergence. At no point was there genuine accountability to those harmed by his teachings. No public reckoning with the policies he influenced. No apology to LGBTQ communities vilified under his leadership. And yet, many forgave him. Psychologists studying religious authority note that figures like Haggard succeed because they occupy emotional territory beyond logic. Followers don't just listen, they invest identity. To reject the leader is to destabilize one's own sense of meaning. Forgiveness becomes easier than confrontation. Ted Haggard fooled millions not by lying outright, but by preaching certainty while living ambiguity, by presenting himself as morally resolved while internally divided. His life became a demonstration of how ideological purity demanded from others often hides personal chaos. In the aftermath, New Life Church survived but never fully recovered its influence. The evangelical movement endured reputational damage. Trust, once broken, became harder to grant, and the uncomfortable truth lingered. If one of the most powerful pastors in America could live a secret life this extensive, while shaping national policy and spiritual belief, how many others remained unseen? Ted Haggard was not exposed because systems worked. He was exposed because someone spoke, and the millions who believed him were left with the same question that echoes through every fall from grace story: was the faith false, or merely the man who claimed to represent it? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For decades, Paul Shanley was seen as a symbol of progressive Catholic ministry in America. He spoke the language of compassion, reform, and inclusion. He positioned himself as a priest who challenged rigid doctrines and offered refuge to the marginalized. To parents, he appeared thoughtful. To colleagues, articulate. To the public, sincere. But behind the carefully maintained image was a long, predatory pattern of abuse that would remain hidden for years, shielded not by secrecy alone, but by trust. Paul Shanley was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1968, during a period of upheaval within the church. The world was changing rapidly, and Shanley embraced that change openly. He became known for his unconventional sermons and advocacy on social issues, earning attention for questioning traditional teachings on sexuality and authority. To some, he was brave; to others, unsettling. But few suspected the truth of what his influence concealed. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Shanley held positions in various parishes across Massachusetts, working closely with children and families. He often presented himself as an advocate for youth, someone who listened, who understood, who offered guidance beyond the pulpit. Parents trusted him explicitly. Children were encouraged to confide in him. His role placed him deep inside homes, schools, and private moments where authority went unquestioned. Behind the scenes, Shanley was abusing children. The misconduct was not isolated. It was repeated, deliberate, and facilitated by his access as a priest. Victims later described acts that began under the guise of spiritual counseling and escalated into explicit sexual abuse. For the children involved, the harm was compounded by confusion. This was not a stranger, not an outsider, but a priest, someone they had been taught represented goodness and God. What made Shanley particularly dangerous was his ability to intellectually rationalize abuse. Evidence later revealed that he subscribed to fringe ideologies that framed adult-child sexual relationships as consensual or misunderstood. This internal justification allowed him to continue offending while maintaining an outward appearance of moral concern. His sermons spoke of love and understanding. His actions betrayed the most basic duty of protection. For years, complaints were raised. Parents questioned his behavior. Church members expressed concern. Victims attempted to speak. Each time, the institutional response followed a familiar pattern: quiet reassignment, internal discussion, and silence. Rather than remove Shanley from ministry, church officials transferred him between parishes, effectively expanding the number of potential victims while preserving the church's reputation. This pattern of protection was not unique to Shanley, but his case would come to symbolize it. The truth finally began to surface in the early 2000s, when investigative journalists from the Boston Globe exposed widespread sexual abuse cover-ups within the Catholic Church. Shanley's name appeared repeatedly in internal documents, not as an anomaly, but as an example of known risk ignored. Records showed that church leadership had long been aware of allegations against him and failed to act decisively. The public response was explosive. As survivors stepped forward, Shanley's carefully cultivated image collapsed. Testimonies described devastation that extended far beyond childhood addiction, depression, broken families, and loss of faith. Many victims spoke of how abuse destroyed their ability to trust authority in any form. The betrayal was not just personal, it was spiritual. In 2005, Paul Shanley was arrested and charged with multiple counts of child rape and sexual assault. The trial that followed forced the details into public view. Survivors testified about abuse that had occurred decades earlier, explaining not only what was done to them, but how long they had carried the trauma in silence. In 2007, Shanley was convicted and sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison. The verdict brought a measure of justice, but it could not undo the damage. For many survivors, the trial reopened wounds. For the church, it deepened an already massive crisis of credibility. Shanley was officially laicized, removed from the priesthood, but the act felt symbolic compared to the years he had been allowed to operate freely. What disturbed observers most was not only Shanley's crimes, but how easily they were enabled. He did not hide in shadows, he preached openly, he advocated publicly, he operated within full view of an institution that valued reputation over protection. Psychologists later emphasized that predators in positions of moral authority rely not only on access, but on trust structures that discourage questioning. Faith communities, especially hierarchical ones, often teach obedience as virtue. Shanley exploited that dynamic precisely. Today, Paul Shanley's name remains tied to one of the darkest chapters in modern religious history, not because he was alone, but because his case proved how systemic failure can empower individual evil. He preached compassion while committing cruelty. He spoke about reform while abusing innocence. He fooled communities not by force, but by representing himself as safe. And the truth left behind an enduring question. When morality is used as camouflage, who protects the vulnerable when the protector himself is the threat? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the early 1990s, if you turned on religious television in America, you were almost guaranteed to encounter Robert Tilton. With manic energy, tear-streaked eyes, and relentless intensity, he preached a theology that promised immediate results. Wealth, healing, salvation, all could be unlocked, he said, through one simple act: sending money. To millions of viewers, Tilton presented himself as God's appointed messenger for prosperity, a man who could intervene between heaven and hardship if believers demonstrated enough faith. What his audience never saw was what happened to their prayers after the cameras stopped rolling. Robert Tilton was born in 1946 and rose to prominence during the golden age of televangelism. His program, Success in Life, aired on thousands of stations worldwide and reached an estimated 200 million viewers at its peak. He spoke directly to the desperate, the terminally ill, the indebted, the grieving. He framed poverty as a spiritual failure and wealth as proof of divine favor. Giving to his ministry wasn't generosity, it was obedience. Every broadcast followed a familiar structure. Tilton warned of spiritual blockage, unseen forces preventing blessings. Then he offered a solution. Viewers were instructed to write prayer requests and send donations, often urged to give specific amounts tied to biblical symbolism. In return, Tilton promised miracles, cancelled debt, restored marriages, healed bodies. The mail poured in. Thousands of letters daily arrived at Tilton's ministry headquarters in Texas. Many were written by people at the end of their strength. They described cancer diagnoses, eviction notices, addiction, and suicidal despair. For these viewers, writing to Tilton was not casual. It was an act of last hope. What happened next defined the scandal. In 1991, investigative journalist Diane Sawyer aired a report on Primetime Live that exposed the operation behind Tilton's ministry. Inside his prayer processing room, staff members were filmed opening letters, removing checks and cash, and discarding the handwritten pleas for help. The prayers, the heart of the faith exchange, were thrown into dumpsters. Only the money moved forward. The footage was devastating. Viewers watched as strangers' desperation was treated like waste. Some letters begged for relief from abuse. Others expressed fear of death. Many explicitly referenced giving beyond their means. None of it mattered once the donation was extracted. Tilton denied wrongdoing. He claimed the report misrepresented standard procedures and insisted that prayers were still covered spiritually. But the visual evidence was undeniable. The exposure shattered his image almost instantly. Donations declined. Stations canceled broadcasts. Lawsuits followed, alleging fraud and emotional exploitation. Former followers came forward with stories of irreversible harm. Some had given up medical treatment, believing financial seed faith would heal them. Others emptied retirement accounts. One woman testified that she sent money meant for rent, convinced eviction would be divinely prevented. When miracles failed to manifest, Tilton's theology turned the blame inward. Faith was insufficient, belief inadequate. That self-blame was part of the mechanism. Prosperity theology, as preached by Tilton, weaponized hope by making failure the believer's fault. If healing didn't come, the individual hadn't given enough, trusted enough, or surrendered enough. The system protected the preacher entirely. Though Tilton faced numerous civil lawsuits, few resulted in substantial penalties. Much of his operation remained legally protected under religious freedom statutes. No criminal fraud conviction ever fully shut him down. By the late 1990s, Tilton retreated from prominence, but he did not disappear. In the 2000s, his sermons resurfaced online, often clipped, exaggerated, and mocked for their intensity. Younger audiences encountered him as an internet meme, detached from the real suffering behind his broadcasts. Lost in humor was the harm done to real people whose lives were destabilized by belief, sold as certainty. Tilton himself continued ministering quietly, refusing to acknowledge wrongdoing beyond vague spiritual language. Unlike many exposed televangelists, he never publicly apologized for the letters discarded or the people financially ruined. For survivors, that silence mattered more than the scandal. Religious trauma specialists later described Tilton's ministry as a textbook case of hypershare spiritual manipulation. The combination of fear, urgency, promised reward, and moral obligation created psychological dependency. Followers weren't just donating, they were buying hope during vulnerability. What made Tilton especially dangerous wasn't that he claimed miracles. It was that his system converted suffering into profit, while remaining insulated from responsibility. He never physically harmed his followers, but for many, the emotional and financial fallout was life-altering. Years later, former believers described lingering guilt, not just for being deceived, but for having believed at all. Faith, once sincere, became a source of shame. Robert Tilton fooled millions, not through secrecy, but through spectacle. Not through silence, but through constant reassurance. He did not hide exploitation, he preached it as obedience. And when the truth finally surfaced, it revealed something darker than fraud. It showed how easily hope can be monetized, and how quickly prayer becomes disposable once belief turns into business. The haunting question remains, if a miracle requires money, who exactly is being healed? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Wayne Bent, also known as Michael Travasa, became a figure of national infamy as the head of the small religious community La Luz del Mundo in Chalma, New Mexico. Born in 1941, Bent began his ministry as a conventional pastor, but gradually developed a following around a controversial and authoritarian interpretation of faith. He cultivated a devoted community that believed in his spiritual authority, eventually positioning himself as the central figure whose word was considered divine guidance. This story would later shock the nation when allegations of sexual misconduct and exploitation came to light, exposing the darker side of charismatic religious leadership. Bent's church was small but tightly knit, emphasizing strict adherence to his teachings and the concept of moral purification under his direction. He created a sense of spiritual exclusivity, claiming that only those within his community could truly understand or achieve salvation. Members were encouraged to cut ties with outside influences that contradicted his authority, creating an environment where questioning the pastor was framed as a spiritual failure. This isolation, coupled with Bent's charisma and theological manipulation, allowed him to consolidate extraordinary power over his congregants' lives. The initial appeal of Bent's teachings lay in his promise of spiritual enlightenment and community support. Families seeking guidance, purpose, and belonging found themselves drawn into his orbit. Members were told that obedience to Bent's directives was a demonstration of faith, loyalty, and devotion. As a result, the pastor wielded influence over daily life decisions, including finances, personal relationships, and social interactions, creating dependency and loyalty among followers. Allegations of misconduct began to surface in the 1990s, but were initially suppressed due to the insular nature of the community and fear of retaliation. Former members later recounted how Bent leveraged his authority to justify inappropriate relationships and sexual contact, particularly targeting young women within the congregation. He framed these acts as spiritual mentorship or divine instruction, manipulating both religious belief and personal trust to avoid scrutiny. Victims described the psychological coercion as deeply manipulative, blending fear, reverence, and guilt to maintain control over their actions. The situation escalated in the 2000s when formal complaints reached law enforcement. Investigations revealed that Bent had engaged in sexual misconduct with multiple congregants, violating both civil law and moral expectations of religious leadership. The legal scrutiny intensified as authorities gathered evidence, interviewed former members, and examined the extent of Bent's influence over the community. The resulting charges were severe, including sexual assault of minors and adults, highlighting the systemic exploitation facilitated by his religious authority. Bent's trial captured national attention, reflecting both the horror of his actions and the broader societal concerns regarding cult-like religious communities. Court proceedings detailed the methods Bent used to control his followers, including isolation from outside influences, strict adherence to his teachings, and the use of spiritual justification to enforce compliance. Witness testimonies revealed the emotional and psychological trauma endured by victims, many of whom struggled to reconcile their faith with the abuse they experienced. In 2005, Wayne Bent was convicted and sentenced to prison for sexual misconduct, though legal complexities and appeals prolonged the process. The convictions provided some measure of justice for victims. Yet the damage to lives and community trust was extensive and enduring. Families were torn apart, individuals experienced long-term emotional trauma, and the reputation of small religious communities faced skepticism and distrust as a result of the scandal. The aftermath of Bent's actions prompted reflection on broader issues of religious authority, oversight, and protection of vulnerable individuals. Experts emphasized the dangers inherent in communities where a single leader holds unchecked power, highlighting how spiritual influence can be weaponized to manipulate and control. The case became a reference point for discussions on cult behavior, the psychology of coercion, and the ethical responsibilities of religious leaders. For survivors, the consequences of Bent's leadership were profound. Many struggled with long-term psychological effects, including PTSD, depression, and difficulty trusting future authority figures. The betrayal by a trusted spiritual leader created a sense of disillusionment that extended beyond the immediate community, affecting their faith and social connections. The La Luz del Mundo controversy thus serves as a stark reminder of how religious devotion, when misused, can become a mechanism for abuse and exploitation. Bent's story also catalyzed legal and institutional reforms in oversight of religious communities. Law enforcement and child protection agencies developed new protocols to investigate allegations in insular religious settings, ensuring that allegations of abuse could not be easily suppressed by claims of religious authority. Religious scholars and advocacy groups emphasized the importance of transparency, education, and independent monitoring to prevent similar abuses in the future. The case illustrates a profound tension between faith and authority. Wayne Bent preached salvation, spiritual growth, and moral guidance, yet his actions revealed the dangers of concentrated power without accountability. Followers were drawn by promises of divine instruction and personal development, only to experience betrayal, coercion, and trauma. His life is a cautionary tale about the potential for religious authority to be exploited, emphasizing the necessity of vigilance, institutional oversight, and personal discernment in matters of faith. Ultimately, the story of Pastor Wayne Bent exposes the dark side of charisma, trust, and religious devotion. It demonstrates how even well-intentioned spiritual guidance can be manipulated when power is unchecked and accountability is absent. For survivors, investigators, and the public, the lessons are clear. Faith must be accompanied by transparency, authority must be tempered with oversight, and vigilance is essential to protect those who place their trust in religious leaders. The shocking truth behind Bent's ministry reminds us that even within the walls of faith, deception and exploitation can lurk behind sermons, prayers, and promises of salvation. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Marcial Maciel de Golado, founder of the Legionaries of Christ, a Roman Catholic religious order based in Mexico, was once celebrated as one of the most influential and dynamic figures in modern Catholicism. Born in 1920 Pulgadas Cotija, Michoacán, Mexico, Maciel demonstrated early charisma, ambition, and a keen sense of organization. His life's work appeared dedicated to the spiritual formation of young men, religious education, and global expansion of his order. For decades, he commanded admiration from clergy, laity, and benefactors, gaining access to wealth, influence, and international recognition. Yet, behind the accolades lay decades of sexual abuse, manipulation, and deception, ultimately revealing a pattern of profound betrayal against the very community he claimed to serve. Maciel's rise within the Catholic Church was meteoric. He founded the Legionaries of Christ in 1941, emphasizing strict discipline, intellectual formation, and unwavering loyalty to the Church and its hierarchy. His vision was compelling. Young men would dedicate themselves fully to God, pursue moral, and spiritual excellence, and serve society through education, missions, and pastoral work. With carefully orchestrated messaging, rigorous training, and a disciplined organizational structure, Maciel expanded his influence rapidly, attracting students, seminarians, and wealthy donors who believed in his mission. While the order's external success was undeniable, reports of Maciel's misconduct began to emerge decades before they were publicly acknowledged. Victims, many of whom were minors or seminarians under his direct authority, later revealed patterns of sexual abuse, coercion, and psychological manipulation. Maciel exploited the hierarchical structure of the Legionaries of Christ, leveraging obedience, spiritual authority, and fear of reprisal to maintain secrecy. Those who questioned or resisted faced threats of exclusion, spiritual condemnation, or public shame. The victim's vulnerability, combined with Maciel's charisma and influence, allowed the abuse to persist, largely unchallenged for decades. Despite internal complaints and isolated reports, the Catholic Church often failed to act decisively, either due to Maciel's connections, his personal charisma, or institutional reluctance to confront a prominent figure. In many cases, allegations were dismissed, ignored, or minimized. The combination of Maciel's organizational control and the Church's reluctance to intervene created a perfect storm, allowing the abuse to continue while maintaining a public image of moral and spiritual leadership. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, investigative journalism and testimonies from former seminarians and victims brought Maciel's misconduct into the public eye. Reports documented sexual abuse, drug use, and the exploitation of seminarians under the guise of spiritual mentorship. The revelations sparked outrage within the Church and the broader public, as supporters, benefactors, and clergy struggled to reconcile the public image of Maciel with the heinous acts described by victims. The scandal prompted deep reflection on accountability, institutional oversight, and the responsibilities of religious leaders entrusted with the welfare of minors and vulnerable individuals. In 2006, Pope Benedict XVI ordered an investigation into Maciel and his leadership of the Legionaries of Christ. The Vatican concluded that Maciel had engaged in grave misconduct, including sexual abuse, drug addiction, and psychological manipulation, confirming the accounts of multiple victims. While Maciel had largely evaded legal prosecution due to his advanced age and health, the Vatican's censure and public acknowledgement marked a critical step in addressing decades of abuse and institutional complicity. The Legionaries of Christ underwent extensive reforms, including restructuring leadership, revising policies, and implementing safeguards to protect seminarians and members from future abuse. The personal and societal consequences of Maciel's actions were profound. Victims reported lifelong trauma, including emotional and psychological scars, difficulty trusting authority figures, and struggles with faith. Families who had supported the order financially and spiritually felt betrayed, experiencing a profound sense of disillusionment. The broader Catholic community was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about oversight, power, and accountability within religious institutions, leading to significant debates about how such abuses could persist for decades without intervention. Maciel's story also illustrates the mechanisms by which spiritual authority can be exploited. He leveraged hierarchical obedience, religious rhetoric, and institutional prestige to conceal his misconduct, demonstrating the dangers inherent in unmonitored or highly centralized religious power. Scholars and ethicists have cited his case as a textbook example of organizational abuse, highlighting the interplay between personal charisma, institutional complicity, and the vulnerability of followers. Even after public exposure, the legacy of Maciel's leadership continues to challenge institutions and individuals. The Legionaries of Christ have worked to rebuild credibility, implement safeguards, and acknowledge past failures. Yet the trauma inflicted on victims remains enduring. The scandal prompted broader reforms within the Catholic Church, including greater transparency, mandatory reporting, and independent oversight to prevent abuse by clergy and religious leaders in other communities. For those impacted directly, Maciel's life serves as a cautionary tale of trust betrayed, faith exploited, and the perils of concentrated authority. Communities learn that devotion and obedience, when combined with unchecked power, can be manipulated to facilitate harm. The psychological, emotional, and spiritual consequences for victims were severe. highlighting the urgent need for vigilance, accountability, and institutional responsibility in religious organizations worldwide. Ultimately, Pastor Marcial Maciel's story is a harrowing reminder that even leaders entrusted with spiritual guidance can wield power destructively. While his outward persona promised moral leadership, discipline, and service, the hidden reality was exploitation, abuse, and betrayal. The enduring lesson for communities, religious institutions, and individuals is that faith must always be accompanied by transparency, oversight, and a culture that prioritizes protection over prestige. Maciel's legacy is both a warning and a call to action. The responsibility of leadership is sacred, and when it is abused, the consequences are devastating, long-lasting, and indelible. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Jim Bakker, founder of the PTL Club, Praise the Lord Club, and the PTL television network, became a household name in the 1970s and 1980s as one of America's most prominent televangelists. Born in 1940 in Michigan, Bakker combined charisma, ambition, and a keen understanding of media to build an empire of religious broadcasting that promised salvation, prosperity, and spiritual fulfillment to millions. However, behind the smiling facade of prayer, faith, and televised sermons lay financial deception, sexual misconduct, and a scandal that would ultimately rock the nation, leaving a lasting impact on the perception of televangelism in America. Bakker's rise to prominence was meteoric. After joining the Assemblies of God Church as a youth, he quickly demonstrated an aptitude for preaching, leadership, and fundraising. By the early 1970s, he had partnered with Tammy Faye Bakker, his wife, to create the PTL Club, a religious television program designed to reach a national audience. The show combined charismatic preaching, musical performances, testimonials, and calls for donations, blending entertainment with spiritual messaging to attract viewers from across the country. PTL's success was fueled by Bakker's ability to connect emotionally with viewers, conveying urgency, hope, and personal spiritual guidance. The program encouraged donations through dramatic appeals, often promising divine reward and spiritual prosperity in exchange for support. Bakker positioned himself as both a spiritual guide and a conduit to blessings, creating a sense of obligation and trust among millions of viewers who considered him a moral authority. The PTL empire expanded rapidly, culminating in the construction of Heritage USA, a sprawling Christian-themed amusement park and resort in Fort Mill, South Carolina. Heritage USA became a symbol of Bakker's success, blending faith, entertainment, and commerce. It attracted thousands of visitors, including tourists, congregants, and donors, and became a hub for Christian conferences and community events. Bakker's charismatic personality, media presence, and ability to generate public enthusiasm solidified his status as one of the leading figures in American evangelicalism. However, cracks in the facade began to appear in the mid-1980s. Investigative journalists, regulators, and former employees uncovered serious financial irregularities, including the misuse of millions of dollars in donations, inflated revenue claims, and fraudulent investment schemes designed to sustain Bakker's extravagant lifestyle. Reports indicated that funds contributed for charitable purposes, television production, and church expansion were diverted to personal accounts. Lavish purchases, and the maintenance of Heritage USA's operations. The situation worsened when allegations of sexual misconduct emerged, including accusations that Bakker had engaged in improper relations with church staff under circumstances that exploited power and authority. These allegations, combined with the financial scandal, created a storm of public outrage. The media coverage was relentless, and the PTL network's credibility collapsed almost overnight. The spectacle of Bakker's rise and fall captivated the nation, serving as both a cautionary tale and a dramatic exposé of the vulnerabilities inherent in charismatic religious leadership. In 1987, Bakker resigned from PTL amid mounting scrutiny, and the organization filed for bankruptcy. Legal investigations followed, resulting in convictions for fraud, conspiracy, and financial mismanagement, which led to a 45-year prison sentence, later reduced on appeal. The trials exposed the mechanics of deception, including falsified financial records, misleading fundraising appeals, and manipulation of congregants' trust. The case illustrated how charisma, authority, and perceived moral legitimacy could be exploited to facilitate both financial and personal misconduct. The aftermath for victims, congregants, and the broader religious community was profound. Many donors and supporters experienced financial loss, emotional betrayal, and disillusionment. Former employees and staff recounted fear, pressure to comply with unethical directives, and personal trauma associated with Bakker's misconduct. The scandal also had a ripple effect across televangelism, prompting calls for regulatory oversight, transparency, and ethical reform within religious broadcasting. Critics argued that unchecked authority, combined with media influence, created conditions in which exploitation could thrive. Despite his fall from grace, Bakker's story continued to unfold in the public eye. After serving a portion of his prison sentence, he returned to televangelism, hosting new programs and reaching a smaller but dedicated audience. While some viewed this as redemption or second chances, others criticized the continued influence of a figure whose past actions had caused widespread harm. The duality of Bakker's legacy, charismatic preacher and convicted fraudster, remains emblematic of the complex interplay between faith, authority, and accountability. Psychologists, religious scholars, and ethicists have examined the PTL scandal to understand the mechanisms of manipulation and exploitation. Bakker's case demonstrates how authority figures can use perceived spiritual legitimacy to pressure individuals, encourage financial contributions, and conceal unethical behavior. It also highlights the importance of institutional checks, independent oversight, and critical discernment among followers to prevent similar abuses. Heritage USA, once a symbol of Bakker's power and vision, became a cautionary emblem of the dangers of combining faith, wealth, and unchecked authority. The park's closure, bankruptcy, and subsequent sales marked the tangible collapse of an empire built on the trust of millions. Survivors, donors, and observers were forced to confront the reality that spiritual promises could be exploited for personal gain, leaving lasting economic, emotional, and spiritual consequences. Ultimately, Pastor Jim Bakker's story forces reflection on the delicate balance between faith and authority. His life illustrates how the promise of salvation, prosperity, and guidance can be manipulated when oversight is absent and charisma goes unchecked. While he brought comfort and inspiration to millions, his legacy is overshadowed by deception, exploitation, and scandal. For viewers and communities, the lessons are clear. Faith must be accompanied by discernment, transparency, and accountability, and trust, once betrayed, carries consequences that resonate far beyond the pulpit. Bakker's rise and fall remain a stark reminder that even those who preach hope and salvation can harbor secrets that shatter trust, manipulate devotion, and exploit belief. His story closes the chapter on one of the most dramatic examples of a pastor who fooled millions, leaving an indelible mark on American religious history and the understanding of power, morality, and accountability in spiritual leadership. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Tony Alamo's story is one of the most disturbing examples of how religious authority can be twisted into a tool of control, exploitation, and abuse. Born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in 1934, Alamo reinvented himself as a preacher in the 1960s, adopting the name Tony Alamo and presenting himself as a fiery messenger of God. His rise coincided with a period of social upheaval in America. When many were searching for spiritual guidance and alternative communities, Alamo seized this opportunity, founding the Alamo Christian Foundation with his wife Susan in Hollywood, California. Together, they attracted followers with promises of salvation, healing, and a life devoted to Christ. But behind the sermons and hymns, Alamo was building something far darker, a cult that would eventually be exposed for systematic abuse, fraud, and exploitation. The early days of the Alamo Christian Foundation seemed harmless enough to outsiders. Susan Alamo, with her charismatic personality, drew in young people disillusioned with mainstream society. Tony, meanwhile, preached with intensity, warning of the dangers of sin and the need for absolute devotion. Their ministry grew rapidly, and by the 1970s they had relocated to Arkansas, establishing compounds where followers lived communally. To the faithful, these compounds were sanctuaries. To outsiders, they increasingly resembled prisons. Alamo demanded total obedience. Followers were required to surrender their possessions, cut ties with family members, and dedicate themselves entirely to the ministry. As the community expanded, Alamo's control deepened. He positioned himself as a prophet, claiming direct communication with God. His sermons were filled with apocalyptic warnings, instilling fear in followers who believed that leaving the ministry meant eternal damnation. He enforced strict rules, dictating how members dressed, spoke, and behaved. Those who disobeyed were publicly humiliated, beaten, or ostracized. Children were raised under this regime, indoctrinated from birth into a world where Tony Alamo's word was law. The crimes began to unfold gradually, hidden beneath layers of religious rhetoric. Alamo exploited his followers for labor, forcing them to work long hours without pay in businesses owned by the ministry. These ventures included clothing companies, printing presses, and construction projects. Profits flowed directly to Alamo, funding his lavish lifestyle. While followers lived in poverty, Alamo enjoyed luxury cars, fine clothes, and expensive homes. He justified this disparity by claiming that he was God's chosen messenger, deserving of earthly rewards. But financial exploitation was only part of the horror. Alamo's abuse extended to the most vulnerable children. Over time, allegations surfaced that he had sexually abused minors within the community. Survivors later testified that Alamo groomed young girls, marrying them in secret ceremonies and subjecting them to years of abuse. He manipulated scripture to justify his actions, twisting religious teachings into tools of coercion. For the victims, the trauma was compounded by the isolation of the compound and the fear of eternal punishment if they spoke out. Law enforcement began investigating Alamo in the 1990s, initially focusing on financial crimes. The Internal Revenue Service pursued him for tax evasion, and in 1994, he was convicted and served time in prison. Yet even behind bars, his influence lingered. Loyal followers continued to operate businesses and spread his teachings. When he was released, Alamo attempted to rebuild his empire, but the walls were closing in. By the 2000s, more survivors came forward, detailing the abuse they had endured. Their testimonies painted a chilling picture of life inside the Alamo Christian Foundation: forced labor, physical punishment, and sexual exploitation. In 2008, federal agents raided Alamo's compound in Arkansas, rescuing children and gathering evidence. The investigation revealed decades of abuse hidden behind the facade of religious devotion. In 2009, Alamo stood trial for transporting minors across state lines for sexual purposes. The courtroom became a place of reckoning, where survivors confronted the man who had terrorized them. Prosecutors presented evidence of his manipulation, his secret marriages to underage girls, and the trauma inflicted on countless victims. Alamo, defiant to the end, denied the charges, claiming he was being persecuted for his faith. But the jury saw through his lies. He was convicted and sentenced to 175 years in prison, a sentence that ensured he would never walk free again. The outcome was a moment of justice, but the scars remained. Survivors spoke of the difficulty of rebuilding their lives after years of indoctrination and abuse. Communities once drawn to Alamo's message were left grappling with the trauma of his crimes. Families were torn apart, children grew up haunted by memories of violence, and trust in religious institutions was deeply shaken. Tony Alamo died in prison in 2017, but his legacy endures as a chilling reminder of how easily faith can be weaponized. His story raises haunting questions. How can one man convince so many to surrender their lives? How does charisma mask cruelty? And how can communities protect themselves from leaders who cloak exploitation in the language of salvation? The reflection is sobering. Alamo's empire was built not on faith, but on fear. His followers believed they were serving God, but in reality, they were serving a predator. The tragedy of the Alamo Christian Foundation is not just the crimes committed, but the betrayal of trust, the manipulation of belief, and the destruction of innocence. For viewers, the takeaway is clear: vigilance is essential, and blind devotion can be dangerous. The stories you've witnessed in this video reveal a sobering truth. Behind the sermons, prayers, and promises of salvation, some pastors exploited faith, manipulated trust, and profited from devotion. From charismatic televangelists to influential megachurch leaders and secluded cult figures, the consequences of unchecked authority have been devastating financially, emotionally, and spiritually for countless individuals and communities. Faith is sacred, yet when leadership is corrupted, the results are real and lasting. Subscribe to uncover more deep investigations into the hidden truths behind those who claim moral and spiritual authority, but act in secrecy and deception. Like this video if these cases opened your eyes to the dangers of blind trust, and share to help others recognize warning signs in those who wield spiritual influence. Because in a world where charisma can mask corruption, understanding the full story is the first step toward vigilance, accountability, and protecting yourself and your community from those who preach righteousness but live in deception.